Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're excited to discuss some of the key concepts revolving around the topic of identity and access management, delving into the issues of user privacy and authentication. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I'd like to quickly inform you of a few housekeeping matters. Today's webinar is being recorded and we will be sharing the link with you via email. We really want this webinar to be as interactive as possible, so please take note of the chat box to the right-hand side of the presentation slides, where you can submit any questions. Q&As will be addressed at the end of the presentations. Any questions we don't have time to address will be answered directly by email. Lastly, we do have a quick survey for you to complete at the end of the Q&As. We'd greatly appreciate if you took the time to fill out the review, as your opinions will affect future events. Now I'd like to introduce to you our guest speakers. Today we have Peter Reid from Bath Spa University with us. Peter is a qualified librarian specialising in the maintenance and development of library systems. He configures all library resources for online access, utilising SAML, federated and IP authentication, as well as granular access, troubleshooting and testing. Over the last 10 years, Peter has worked on the digital side of academic libraries, with a focus on access management in the last 6. This has led to Peter's collaboration with IT departments on many single sign-on projects. Our second speaker is Graham Mason. With over 25 years of experience in the field of identity and access management, Graham has been involved in several high-profile JISC-funded Shibboleth projects as lead, manager and advisor. Graham co-founded Overt Software Solutions in 2010, having previously spent over a decade in the variety of management, development and operational roles in the UK educational sector. This experience has shaped Overt Software's operations regarding its ethos of exceptional service and honest expert advice. And finally, we have Chris Andre, CTO from Overt Software Solutions, joining us today. Chris has been involved within the field of identity and access management for over 10 years, developing and providing solutions for HE and FE sectors. Chris will be supporting us with some of the more technical aspects of this webinar, and all 3 of today's webinar guests will be available to help answer your questions at the end of the presentations. At this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to our first speaker, Peter Reid, who is going to start today's presentations. Peter, if you would like to begin.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Helena, and thanks everyone for coming. Good afternoon. So as Helena said, yeah, I've been working in this area more and more over the past few years. I would be hesitant to class myself as an expert, but kind of in keeping with the tradition of the accidental systems librarian, I find myself doing more and more work in this and becoming more and more interested. So my purpose here is to share some of my thoughts and experience in this area, focusing on how librarians as traditional intermediaries can, from our current position, make responsible choice on users' behalf, first of all. Confidently and robustly assert the terms of resource licenses and establish ground from which we can begin to empower our users in matters of ownership of data and privacy. So that's what I'm going to go through, kind of moving towards that endpoint. As you may have seen in the blurb for this, the question we started with is, why is identity and access management of interest to librarians specifically? So the first and most obvious answer here is that we have traditionally upheld the maintenance of a patron's privacy as a professional duty. So what I mean is there's robust statements from our professional associations, the American Library Association, IFLA and CILIP, supporting this. But it's natural, I think, that as our role in managing collections has largely switched from that of custodian of local content to broker of access to subscribed content hosted elsewhere, that we have lost ground somewhat. I think that's a natural development. I think in a paper earlier this year, the librarian and writer Roger Schonfeld, who's the Director of Library and Scholarly Communications at Ithaca SNR, asked the pertinent question, who is competing to own researcher identity? Now, he listed the contenders as ResearchGate, Elsevier, Clarivate, OrcID, and also Silicon Valley giants such as Google and Facebook. But notably, he didn't include libraries or universities. This is strange initially from my perspective, as researchers and students are members of the institution primarily. But just to quote from his paper, he said, The higher education sector remains absent from this landscape. We have seen no groundswell of effort to develop decentralized and/or community-controlled infrastructures to enable researcher-centric solutions. So that's the kind of point we're hoping to move towards. And although it's my focus here, I think that quotation shows it's about more than just protecting privacy, but I think about beginning to get to grips with a much wider challenge. And I think it would be a benefit to have more librarians involved. I think that the challenge and the questions being asked demand a response. And I think the institutional IDP is a good place to start answering these questions. So just how and where to start. So quoting from another writer, Clifford Lynch, who I recently learned formed some of the access management principles which really gave birth to federated access management in a white paper back in 1998, suggested if you are using Shibboleth for authentication to external content platforms, be sure to understand your institution's attribute release policy, first of all, and the governance around the development and maintenance of that policy. So that was from a paper, a more recent paper than 1998. That was from 2019. The question could be, what is that policy? Is it spelled out and articulated anywhere? And who is contributing to that conversation? I think in the case of university, it's likely to be a contractual agreement at registration, which staff and students will sign, which legally covers the propagation of student data to university systems and third parties. But moving towards that more user-centric point of view in the context of a university, or is that too liberal a use of implied consent? The question boils down to finding out what are we releasing and to whom in terms of the student data when it comes to accessing resources. So taking a report generated from an example IDP, we can visualize this. So say on a sort of qualitative scale, visually representing privacy neutral general indicators of membership as green, and more sensitive PII data as I've done here, ever deeper shades of orange. We can see that in this example, the UK Access Management Federation there is getting a default attribute release, including some of that more sensitive data into a default bundle, whereas other SPs outside the Federation could be getting those in addition to more sensitive data. So it's something to look out for, is that the policy in practice might be too liberal. Data which the provider doesn't need and hasn't asked for may be being given away. So I mentioned governance as well. Clifford Lynch recommended understanding the governance around the policy. We're starting to see at BASPAR more scrutiny from heads of compliance and legal counsel, information security managers, etc., of what data is being transferred, with specific reference to preference for pseudonymized IDs in terms of that student data, general call for transparency and demonstrable compliance as it relates to sharing data with third parties, and specifically, and of relevance to this talk particularly, detail of what transferred is, what data is being transferred at the point of sign-in. So kind of moving towards the actual experience of using these web services. So from my position as an intermediary and systems digital services librarian role, we've added several questions to our workflow for the acquisitions lead to consider when just talking about with the providers about the new resources as we're setting them up, asking questions such as, are they asking for non-standard PII attributes, such as email, first name or last name? Do they have a click-through agreement? So by that I mean where the data subject themselves further inputs information as part of registration with the system after they've authenticated and authorized. So it's really a condition of using the service there in the form of a web form. And about the privacy policy, data sharing outside the EU, etc. So not necessarily things that are written into the contract at this stage, but it's just something that's a bit of a groundswell towards. So we're establishing then some grounds to begin making responsible choices on users' behalf. So what could we do? Say with that default attribute release I mentioned earlier, taking an example such as Science Direct or an ESP, really, you can see that not all of those attributes are required or actually consumed by the SP. But information is given, say in the UK Access Management Federation available services page, about what attributes are needed, are they required? saying no in the UK Access Management Federation there. I found the RefEd's metadata explorer tool very useful. So for a different federation there, you can see in the slide the actual metadata and the attribute marked up there saying, is it required, is it true? So you can see, and that's very helpful when that's included. That could be the basis for cutting back. So returning to the example I gave there, looking at the required attributes only, the UK Access Management Federation could do with only 2 there, and just cutting back to a lot less, really. So that's something to do initially. I'm aware that not all universities, libraries, or IDP owners have institutions have as close a connection with part of the IT that manages its single sign-on services. It's an area of IT supplier liaison and collaboration is where I've spent most of my career in libraries, really. And I think liaison in this area is important to a library service in the same manner in which librarians have traditionally had to lobby within their institutions for budgets, for places on the right committees, teaching liaison within schools. And yeah, 2 things I've always found very helpful in this is taking an interest in how the technical stuff works, but perhaps not too much. The experts will do the rest, and really trying to build those relationships, and face-to-face meetings are especially important with that, really. Getting to know the people a little bit and maintaining those ongoing relationships. A bit about the project where we actually migrated to the overt IDP back in 2017. We've got some of the key players are pictured in that photo I took a little while later there from Bath Spa. Yeah, the project manager invited the overt staff for a site visit. I find it very helpful to meet the people because we do have that ongoing relationship for configuration, troubleshooting and testing during the project and afterwards. And particularly, we faced a particular challenge during the project to migrate, particularly to do with those pseudonymized IDs that I mentioned earlier. We've used them as a kind of privacy standard. It's good to use, especially for services that depend on personalization and the third-party user account to function, such as RefWorks or ebook suppliers, which have notes and that sort of thing. And we found that we could not generate that unique pseudonymized attribute across the 2 IDPs. So Overt wrote a script for us which did that, but it involved lots of testing. The library, it's good that the library is involved because we understood the kind of end user requirement there. And yeah, we managed to make that migration pretty seamless. No end users didn't really notice, so I have to do things like talks here to kind of raise awareness of it. But actually, the script that had maintained that third-party data on the services wasn't. We had to decommission it last year, so we had to kind of get all of the suppliers who'd done this, so EBSCO, RefWorks, to update those unique user IDs at the same time on the same day when the script was decommissioned. This is a rather odd slide, but it's just showing the actual usernames redacted there, old value and new value, unnamed third value there. But I think it was just what I'm trying to say is it took a lot of work and kind of resolving all of these things, but we did do it. And the kind of point I'm trying to make is that we could sustain the personalized memberships, but it took that work and collaboration. And finally, I think it's better that the trade-off be diligence for the library, for the institution, than loss of privacy or security for the user. Had we used email or some other slightly more sensitive data, the user IDs, to maintain those accounts, there wouldn't have been a problem. We wouldn't have had to have worked, but it would have been a slightly less of a balance, usability, privacy. So that's just one example of some of the work we've done. Now, as I said, we'd like to move to a point towards more empowering users and actually informing them at the point at which they're signing into services. I was involved in a panel a couple of months ago with including a JISC student passer, a chap called Ganesh, but someone from the publisher side and myself as a librarian, talking about the issues of balancing usability with privacy. And one thing Ganesh has said is that when the attributes of this information are shared, there needs to be an initial breakdown about where the data goes and why. then the students will know how important their decision is to publishers and libraries. So it was kind of from an educational point of view, really, of kind of understanding what's going on behind the scenes. As a library, libraries are involved in teaching. I'm interested in that angle of kind of the digital literacy or the ethics around this and making that part of the experience. But we're thinking about moving towards the consent form and having this at the point at which you've clicked into a database or one of your resources, just showing what attributes have been shared and then giving the user some options there as to how they'd like to continue to be asked. So it's not too different, perhaps. I know we've got it on the web with cookies consent. It's a standard thing with GDPR. It'd be interesting to see from people who are listening what the thoughts are on this. We haven't gone live with anything, but it'd be a good thing to test. And as I said, legal and compliance and people are asking about this type of thing at this point, so it may be something we move towards. So finally, just ending my bit, that question I asked at the start, why is it of interest to librarians specifically? I think as an intermediary agent, which the IDP is between the reading material, the host institution, the university, and the patron, that's like a librarian, really. That's what we do. So it's a good space to have that conversations around this. Around the privacy debate and analytics and that sort of thing, if the institutional need is to maximize ROI with analytics and that sort of thing, the IDP is crucial to have a kind of voice on there. Getting that balance with privacy, then the IDP is crucial too. My overall point is that it should be up to the profession and the institution to decide, and I hope I've shared some useful things around our experience in that area. With that, I'll hand over to Graham.
Thank you, Helena. Thank you, Peter. As Peter's presentation highlights, making sure that we only release the necessary amount of information to service providers, thereby preserving user privacy, is very important. Unfortunately, things can get missed, and sometimes we might not be sure what attribute is required or being released. It can be a worry. So in this section of the webinar, I'm going to be looking at things from a different angle. I feel I'm still achieving the same aim as Peter, and at very least enhancing the user's privacy by looking at privacy from an authorization angle. What private data is being released about the user, thus preserving the privacy and only releasing the minimum amount of attributes, is important. But what if you could stop that data being released and only allow the correct user access to the resource before it arrives at the service provider? Hopefully I can convince you in this part of the presentation there might be another way. An important note, authorization on the RDP happens before any attributes are released to the service provider, thereby ensuring that the correct person has access to the resource. With this in mind, I believe I can enhance the user's privacy by taking a granular access approach. To make the case for a granular access approach, and before Chris gives in-action demonstration, my session will cover how you can control what users and their access to content. You, as the RDP owner, have the ability to make authorization decisions. And maybe granular access might provide you with a fail-safe RDP authorization mechanism. Some context to what I'm about to discuss, in that I'm going to assume some expected responsibilities regarding the RDP and SP. So point one, typically in a federated model, the RDP should be responsible for the authentication of the users. And as Peter discussed, only release the necessary attributes to the service provider. Point two, the service provider should then be responsible for the authorization of that user. For example, the service provider should use the attributes that have been received to decide if the user from the organization is allowed to have access to the resource and at what level. Point three, as Peter's highlighted, the RDP needs to or try to make sure that the information being released to the service provider is accurate. Now, this appears fairly straightforward, and as my point two mentioned in the previous slide, the service provider should use the attributes that have been received to decide if the user from the organization is allowed access and at what grade level. Just a note here, service provider are doing a wonderful job and will understand your needs regarding privacy and attributes, so please don't think we have a problem with service providers. However, in my experience, I've known service providers solely look just for an authentication and not making use of the federated attributes that have been sent to them. In other words, they're just checking for a session. Another example, the service provider could be looking for the entity person scope affiliation attribute. However, because it's a multi-valued attribute, they might accept anybody that releases, say, the value member and not make use of other values. And this brings into question around this attributes specifies a person's role within inside the organization and why I have mentioned member value. As I pointed out, member is part of a multi-value set of values within this attribute and is intended to highlight a person's affiliation or affiliations within the organization. For example, a learner is a member of the organization and a student, so will have the values student and member. Teacher has the values employee, faculty, staff, and member. And as I've highlighted in the slide, a person, say a member of the non-teaching staff, can fill several roles, for example, student, staff, employee, and member values. Affiliates, alumni, and walk-in libraries indicate that the holder has some definable affiliation to the organization. A potential hypothetical problem that might arise from these multi-value relationships, say your license agreement specifies that only students are allowed to have access to resource. What if all staff and student users are set to release member as well as staff and student? For example, there could be a problem in this scenario. On a successful authentication of a staff user, staff and member values are released to the service provider. However, because the service provider are only looking for member, this allows the staff member in and thereby possibly breaking the license agreement. So a question I pose, to ensure correct authorization and peace of mind, could the IDP owner intercept the authentications? In allowing us to answer this question, we need to make the following assumptions. As the IDP owner and purchaser of the resource, you will know what license agreements you have in place. However, as discussed, the service provider should be making authorization decisions based off the attributes provided by the IDP. However, sometimes the service provider might assume or even require that the IDP owner makes authorization decisions. Filter rules aren't enough. Releasing no attributes is not sufficient. As I've pointed out, some service providers might allow access based on session alone. So a solution to my question, would my granular access approach help me overcome some of the problems I've discussed? Yes, I think it might. And as the solution, it is possible, free, with a feature in Shibboleth, and as the IDP administrator, you can make authorization decisions on the IDP using context-checked intercepts. What are context-checked intercepts, or briefly known as checks? Checks are used to interrupt and halt the process on the IDP before releasing any information to the service provider, typically to use to make authorization decisions on the IDP. There is a witty article and some great how-to guide regarding context-checked intercepts on the Shibboleth Consortium site. The link below, and also we'll send it out when we send out the recording. So these checks, they track information about the requests, such as information about the service provider, information about the user, their attributes, the sessions, authentication steps, also environmental information such as IP, browser, and much more. This is all possible with inside Shibboleth, and this feature can be implemented in a simple way, such as checking values of an existing attribute, or you can make it as complex as a management interface with web service APIs. In my diagram here below, my diagram with my little check is activated when an entity ID of the service provider, in this case it's myid.com. Once that's activated, the check then checks the IP address, but it also checks the affiliation of the attribute, and in this case it must equal staff. If it does, then the user is allowed to authenticate to the SP. If not, unfortunately, the authentication is halted. Chris will now demonstrate this feature and process in action. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Helena.
Thanks, Graham. Chris, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks, Helena. So we're just going to quickly show you how the context check intercepts can be integrated into a web application that allows end users to easily make changes and create authorization decisions on the IDP. So we're just in our IDP dashboard here at the moment, and I'm just going to jump into the Grander Access section. And this is the part where the context check intercepts hooks into our API. So we can see we have a few rules here, and I can delete those or edit them from the screen really easily. I'm just going to create a new rule for our easy peasy SP WordPress site just for this demo. So I just click Add New, and then I'm brought to this screen, and I can give the rule a name. And for the entity ID or the service provider, this is actually where we pull in all of the previously used entity IDs into a searchable list. So I can just search for easy peasy here and select that as the service provider. And we can actually add multiple SPs here as well to make the rule apply to more than one resource, but we'll just keep this to easy peasy for the moment. I then just add a comment to describe the rule in a little bit more detail so admins know what this rule is for. And then I can either choose to go for allow conditions, where that will deny anyone access that doesn't meet the allow conditions, or I can create a deny condition which will allow everyone access apart from those that meet the criteria to be denied. And under the condition, we expose the ability to either match a single value, multi-value, or you can go as powerful as you like with regex patterns. And we can select the attribute on this side here as well. For the moment, I'm just going to add a deny condition to say that if SAM account name equals my username CAndre, then don't let me in. And I'll just save that rule, and that's instantly applied, as we can see it's in the list below here. So I'm now just going to attempt to access the easy peasy SP and go to the login page. And I'll be directed to the IDP to log in. And now we have MFA activated on IDP, so I'll just need to quickly pop in the OTP token here. And as you can see, I've been denied access. Before I even get back to the SP, we haven't left the IDP at this point. And this screen can be customized on the IDP to be more user-friendly with contact information and perhaps a reason why the user's not been allowed access today. So if I now just pop back over to the rule screen and change the condition from a deny to an allow. And again, I'll remove this deny condition and just select SAM account name for the allow condition. But this time I'm going to select a multi-value and add myself, CAndre, and gmason as allowed users or allowed values for SAM account name to access the easy peasy SP. And all the other users will be denied access now. So I'll just make this rule always require an MFA token session as well. And then we'll try to access the easy peasy SP again. Now this time I won't actually be prompted to log into the IDP because I already have an existing session. I haven't closed my browser. And if we just log in here, and we can see that I've been authorized access to the easy peasy SP. And as you can see at the top right, I'm logged into the WordPress site. And that was just a quick overview and a quick example of how the context check intercepts can actually be implemented as a full web service rather than just scripts on the IDP. And I'll just hand back over to Helena now.
Okay, thank you, Peter, Graham and Chris, and thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to our guest speakers. As a reminder, if you have any questions that you haven't submitted yet, please enter them into the Q&A section on the right and we'll get through as many questions as we can. Okay, so to begin with, would you use the attribute consent feature in Shibboleth with all resources? Would anyone like to take that question?
I could speak to that if you like, Helena. I suppose it depends on if that becomes a requirement. As I said, there's more interest now or scrutiny being shown. So I think we're in a period of regulation around these things with the obviously GDPR, the California legislation that's gone through recently, and also not related to this, but the accessibility regulations and things like that. So I think things like that there may be more of. Would sort of add the proviso that it would require kind of, I think, usability testing and that sort of thing, really just seeing how it works, making it simplified, not not making sure that it didn't make it too much of a pain. So it's just getting that balance with that. So engaging students in a bit of testing to see, is it getting in the way? But it's not a requirement at the moment. But I from my understanding, it would be it's in keeping with my understanding with where the regulations are pointing, really. So I can see us doing more of it. But and I think it would be on each resource in that case, yeah, if that happened.
Sorry, Chris here as well. Just to add to what Peter's saying as well. I mean, with inside Shibboleth, it's very easy to either blanket apply it to every single resource that's available, or you can specifically apply it to specific resources. There's also the ability to hide certain attributes that may come up. For example, you may be quite happy with just allowing everybody that has that's releasing EduPersonal target ID or persistent ID, since it's pseudonymized, just let that through and don't even show that to the user because it may confuse them, for example. Whereas you want to show the PII attributes with like first name, last name, and email going out. So you can definitely configure things to be more granular in that approach as well. The other thing as well, just highlighting back to obviously it being a bit of an issue in the way that the process works. Back on that screenshot, you could see that there was 3 options as well, which is ask me again next time I log in, or only ask me again if the information changes, or never ask me again for any attribute information for any SP. So the user has a few different options, and it really just gives them back that control.
So there are some insightful answers there to that question. Moving on to the next question. Would you still use the attribute filters with the context check interceptors?
I should probably take this one. So the context check intercepts are a kind of, as Graham kind of said before, it's a bit of a fail-safe thing there where we can definitely do the authorization decisions on the IDP as a kind of a first port of call or last resort, as it were, but you still would use the attribute filters with that. So the filter is actually talking really referencing what Peter's been talking about, where we're releasing specific sets of attributes, whereas the context check intercept is actually looking at it from an authorization point of view, where we only want to allow people access to a resource that are allowed access to the resource. So you'd use both. One to control what's released and one to control who's allowed to release something.
All right, brilliant. Do any of the other guest speakers have anything to add to that question?
I was just going to say, it's. Oh, sorry, Graham, but I don't know if I emphasised, but I just see this whole scenario really as being fundamentally collaborative, and I just don't just mean internally within the university as a collegiate and member organisation, but with the suppliers, with providers of software like Overt, and what Chris was saying, it's kind of meeting in the middle, really. I think over this standard. So I think it's very helpful to have that filter from both sides, as Chris was explaining there.
Oh, I think we've got another question in as well, Helena.
We do, yes. So, roughly how many universities currently make use of the context check intercepts? And that's directed to our Overt guest speakers.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one, and then if anybody's got anything to add. So, well, everybody has the ability to use them. I'd say a large percentage, I would go for probably around about 80-90% of our user base is now using the context check intercepts. Now, as Graham kind of pointed out, they can be in a very simplistic way, which is obviously just using a script that's on the IDP that's doing them, or we can go through a full interface which allows people to just set up rules as we showed on the demo. So a large percentage of them are, and that's just really because it's kind of easier than going through filter rules and scripts really through the interface. So that I think around about 80-90% of our customer base. I don't know if anybody's got anything to add to that at all, Graham.
Well, I think why the subject came up many years ago. It was just peace of mind, really. It's that people wasn't quite sure if somebody managed. They could be a walk-in library, or somebody could have got on the Wi-Fi and they wasn't quite sure about the attributes, but they were sort of accessing a resource that they shouldn't. So really, that's when this subject that came up. But this context check intercepts has been in Shibboleth since 2018. And it's also been updated for the version 4 as well. So it's worth popping onto the consortium site and have a look at the wiki article there, because it highlights quite a lot. But yeah, throughout the world, I bet there's absolutely thousands of people using it.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Graham and Chris. Does anybody else have any other questions you'd like to ask before we finish up this webinar? Okay, well, in that case, thank you to everyone for joining and taking part in our webinar today. Thank you also to Peter, Graham and Chris for sharing your insights and expertise around the topic of identity and access management. We do hope you found this webinar informative and engaging, and please keep an eye out for our webinar satisfaction survey and email containing the webinar recording. Thank you for your time today and have a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.